categories of consumers, we are going to look at the concept of utility, the cardinal utility analysis, the law of diminishing marginal utility, utility maximization. In introduction, before we look at the theory of consumer behavior, let's look at what consumer behavior is all about. Consumer behavior is the action, undertaking, or reaction of a consumer when selecting, buying, or using a particular product that will give him satisfaction or for him to derive utility. In the course of looking at this, we are told that there are many factors that guides the consumer behavior. The psychological factor, the social factor. When we talk about the psychological factor, we look at the motivation, what motivated the consumer in choosing that particular product. We look at the attitude of the consumer towards the particular product and what the belief of the consumer on that particular product. Because for a consumer to have or to desire a particular product, there must something he believes that that particular product can do. So when we talk about the social aspect of the consumer behavior, as a social human being, the consumers live in an environment that live in environments where many people are living, and the consumer can be influenced either from the family or peer groups or educational level. Whenever they want to, in a case of when the consumer wants to buy a particular product, even though a particular consumer has no money to buy that particular product, because of the influence of the peer groups or family or friends, he will force himself to buy that particular product, even if he doesn't have any need for that particular product he wants to buy. And this is a situation we'll talk about the Joneses in the society. So we'll look at the characteristics of individual consumers, such as the demographical and behavioral variables in attempt to understand how people want. It's trying to assess the influence on the consumers from groups such as families, which we've already explained. Now we'll look at the approaches of how the consumer look at the utility. We want to look at the two approaches to consumers. We'll have the marginal utility or the cardinal approach or the ordinal approach. All these approaches how consumers views utility. From the ordinalist approach, the ordinalist asserts that consumers are not measurable. Instead, they introduce a tool called indifference curve. Indifference curve is the combination of shows the combination of two commodities that gives the same satisfaction at the same time. While the cardinalists believe that utility is not measurable, rather that utility is being measured by numbers. So from Jovan 1835 to 1882, it was the first economist that introduced the concept of utility. According to him, he said that utility is the basis on which demands of an individual for a commodity is dependent. So, utility is also defined as the power of commodity or service to satisfy human wants. Utility, let us look at the concept of that utility. That utility is a satisfaction derived by a consumer for consuming a particular product. Utility explains the demand of an individual for a particular commodity, or a satisfaction to measure is a measure of satisfaction. Utility is also subjective to satisfaction, which consumers get from consuming any other goods or services. The cardinal utility analysis. Human wants are unlimited and of different intensity. This means that the means available to man are scarce but have alternative uses. Here, this particular point is telling us that the means available to man are scarce but have alternative uses. For us to understand this thing very well, we'll have to flash our memories back to Dennis Robbins' definition of economics that said that economics is a social science that studies human behavior in relationship between ends and scarcity means which have alternative uses. On these particular uses we are talking about, he is saying that these alternative uses means that scarce resources can be used in alternative ways. For example, when we have coal as a resources, coal can be used in an industry in order to produce goods and services that is being demanded in the economy. Then coal can also be used for running trains. Coal can also be used in domestic cookings. So there are different ways of using a particular resources. That's the essence of the alternative uses. As a result of scarcity of resources, the consumer cannot satisfy all his wants. He has to choose as to which ones that can be satisfied first and which after, if the resources permit. The consumer is confronted with making choice. And we know that in every situation that you need to make, that choice is very, very important, because that's the only thing that will make you satisfy your human wants. For example, a man is thirsty. He goes to the market to satisfy his thirst by purchasing Coca-Cola instead of tea. Whatever he wants to do at a particular time, that choice is very, very important for him to make himself satisfied. The consumer prefers a commodity as a result of utility to be derived, which gives him satisfaction. Before he takes any decision, he will consider what will give him satisfaction at that particular moment. In economics, a consumer buys a commodity that satisfies his utility. The essence of consuming a product is for you to have utility in it. Let us look at the assumptions of cardinal utility. The main assumptions of cardinal utilities are, first, rationality. It is assumed that the consumers are rational in making decisions. And this particular point, the consumer has to think very, very well in order to maximize his profit, in order to maximize his satisfaction with the limited income available to him. Utility is ordinary. We've talked about utility, that utility is not measurable, that it uses indifference curve. And during the using the indifference curve, you will now see the different satisfaction, different level of satisfaction in that utility curve. That's the ranking. We have the diminishing marginal rate of substitution. In the indifference curve analysis, diminishing marginal rate of substitution is also assumed. Consumer preference is contradictory. It is assumed that the individual preference is stable. Whenever an individual is taking a decision on the particular product he wants to derive utility, his preference is always stable. Criticism of cardinal utility. Pareto, an Italian economist, severely criticized the concept of cardinal utility. He stated that utility is neither quantifiable or edible, but can be compared. And this particular point the Pareto is saying that utility is not quantifiable and cannot be edible, but it can be compared. When you compare two different commodities, you now know the ones that will give you utility, the one you derive more utility. He also suggests that the concept of utility should be replaced with scale of preference. He said that because scale of preference will now give you, when you want to select a particular product that will give you utility, you will now select the ones that will give you the highest utility before choosing the second one. Then, according to Hicks and Allen, following the footsteps of Pareto, introduced the technique of indifference curve, that from indifference curve, you'll now be able to know the one that gives you more satisfaction. So the cardinal utility approach is thus replaced by the ordinal utility function, which says that scale of preference should be used. So let's look at the total utility and marginal utility. In economics, the marginal utility is additional satisfaction a consumer derives from extra unit of a particular goods consumed. Because when you are consuming more goods, you are getting your marginal utility is increased. The marginal utility theory refers to increase in satisfaction of a consumer gets from consuming extra unit of commodity. Total utility talks about aggregate, the summation of utility gotten from the satisfaction of the particular consumer or particular consumption of a particular product. Difference between total utility and marginal utility. In economics, utility is the satisfaction an individual derives from consuming a commodity. It is also used to analyze individual preferences within a marketplace. Then here we see the total utility is the aggregate satisfaction, the overall satisfaction gotten from consuming some products. From here, we see that utility, total utility is equal to marginal utility. Marginal utility. The marginal utility is equal to change in total utility over change in quantity. Rate of increase. Total utility increases as more goods are consumed. That the more you consume more products, your marginal utility, the total utility increases. Then total utility is the amount of satisfaction obtained from consuming a particular quantity of goods and services within a given period. That the total utility is the amount of satisfaction derived in the general consumption of a particular product. Law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility describes a familiar and fundamental tendency of human behavior. Here, the law of diminishing marginal utility states that as a consumer consumes more and more products of a specific commodity, the utility from the successive units goes on diminishing. Here, at this particular point, is telling us that the more you consume a particular product, the more your utility increases. The utility you get in consuming the initial one is not the one that you get at the second one. It's not the same level of utility you get when you consume the total one. So the more you consume of a particular product, the more your utility diminishes. According to Gauchen, a German economist, was first explained the law in 1854. Alfred Marshall later reinstated this law in the following words: the additional benefits which a person derived from an increase of his stock of a thing diminishes with every increase in that stock that has already has. So from here, that the additional benefits you derive from the increase in stock diminishes with every increase in stock. If the more you increase that particular product or that particular stock, the satisfaction decreases. Assumptions of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility is true under certain assumptions. There are rationality. In the Cardinal Utility analysis, it is assumed that consumers are rational. They are rational in the sense that they will be very, very conscious of whatever, especially their income. Before they buy anything or before they take decision in buying anything, they will first of all look at their income. Constant marginal utility of money. It is assumed that the theory that the marginal utility of money based for purchasing goods remains constant. So that the marginal utility of money base for purchasing is always constant. Diminishing marginal utility. Another important assumption of utility analysis is that utility gained from the successful unit of a commodity diminishes in a given period of time. That in the process of consuming more product or a particular good, the more you consume, the less utility you derive from that. Stable quantity. It is also assumed that the commodity consumed is taken in suitable and reasonable units. Limitations of. There are some exceptions or limitations to the law of diminishing utility. They are: 1. In the case of intoxicants, consumption of liquor defies the law for short period. The more a person drinks, the more he likes it. However, this is truer only initially. A stage comes when a drunkard too starts taking less and less liquor and eventually stops it. So the rare collection, if there are only two diamonds in the world, the possession of the second diamond will push up the marginal utility. Application to money. The law equally holds good for money. It is true that the more money the man has, the greedier he gets the additional unit of it. If you are a poor man, you won't have the urge to buy commodities or additional one. But once you're rich, you will have the urge to be buying everything, even the most expensive ones. Utility maximization. The law of equimarginal utility is simply an extension of the law of diminishing marginal utility to two or more commodities. The consumer will maximize total utility from his income when the utility from the last money spent on each good is the same. So the consumer will maximize his utility from his income even if the last cover he has. As he buys more of that commodity, the utility of the successful units begins to diminish. So we'll be repeating this over and over. Limitation is protection of law of equimarginal utility. The students will refer to the book. So from the summary, we've talked about the consumer behavior. So here, the law of diminishing marginal utility shows a familiar and fundamental tendency of human behavior that as consumers consume more and more units of a specific product, the utility from the successful units continue reducing. This is applied in the real life situation, that whenever you consume a particular product, the initial utility you derive or satisfaction you derive will not be the second time, will not be like the second one so the more you consume a particular product, the less utility you derive. So in other words, it states that the consumption increases the marginal utility derived from additional units